Breaking tonight, ICE and FBI agents have raided a Washington drug house, arresting a suspected ringleader at the center of a federal investigation.
4:47 a.m., federal agents from ICE, the FBI, and joint DEA task forces executed the largest coordinated drug enforcement operation in Washington state history. By sunrise, they had seized 47 pounds of fentanyl, 31 pounds of crystal methamphetamine, 18 pounds of cocaine, 2.1 million fentanyl pills, and over $2.3 million in cartel cash. They arrested 43 suspects. They dismantled 14 stash houses. And they uncovered something that shook investigators to their core. A network so deeply embedded in local government that it had been operating under protection for nearly a decade. The suspected ringleader? A 34-year-old cartel lieutenant named Marco Alejandro Vega, operating out of a quiet suburban home in Marysville that looked no different from any other house on the block. But what federal agents found inside that residence would expose a criminal enterprise that stretched from the streets of Washington all the way to the command centers of the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico. And that is just the beginning. Because what they discovered in the encrypted files on Vega's laptop pointed to something far more disturbing than a regional drug operation. It pointed to systematic corruption at the highest levels of county government. It pointed to a fictional county executive named Richard Davenport, who prosecutors would later allege had been receiving monthly payments from cartel intermediaries for the past 7 years. Let me show you how deep this goes. 4:32 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, Marysville, Washington. The fog sits heavy over the Stillaguamish River, rolling through empty streets like a ghost that knows what is coming. The neon glow from a 24-hour gas station bleeds into the mist. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once and then falls silent. This is the moment before everything changes. 3 blocks away, an FBI tactical team sits in an unmarked van, breathing slowly, checking their weapons one final time. 2 streets over, an ICE Homeland Security Investigations unit waits in a blacked-out SUV, their thermal imaging equipment locked onto a 2-story house with a chain-link fence and an American flag hanging limp by the garage. Simultaneously, across Snohomish County, 11 other strike teams hold position, waiting for the signal. At exactly 4:47 a.m., that signal comes. The first breach happens at Vega's residence. A flashbang cracks through the pre-dawn silence like a thunderclap from another dimension. The front door splinters inward. Agents in black tactical gear pour through the opening like shadows given purpose, their weapon-mounted lights cutting white beams through the smoke. Inside, chaos erupts. A suspect dives for a back hallway. Another tries to shove a duffel bag under a bed. A woman screams in Spanish. Glass shatters somewhere on the 2nd floor. Within 90 seconds, 5 individuals are face down on the floor with zip ties around their wrists. Marco Alejandro Vega, the man federal prosecutors would later call the Pacific Northwest's most dangerous cartel coordinator, is found in a back bedroom, attempting to destroy a laptop with a hammer. He did not succeed. At the same moment, across Marysville and extending into Everett, Lake Stevens, and Arlington, the other raids unfold with military precision. DEA agents hit a suspected methamphetamine distribution point operating behind a legitimate auto body shop. ICE teams breach a human trafficking transit house where they find 11 undocumented individuals locked in a basement, some of them minors who had been promised legitimate work and instead found themselves prisoners. In Everett, a joint FBI SWAT team storms a fortified warehouse that surveillance had identified as a primary narcotic storage facility. The suspects inside attempt to flee through a backloading dock. They do not get far. By 5:15 a.m., the operation has achieved its primary objectives. 43 suspects are in federal custody. The seizure totals are still being calculated, but the preliminary numbers are staggering. 47 pounds of fentanyl in various forms, 31 pounds of crystal methamphetamine, 18 pounds of cocaine, 2.1 million pressed fentanyl pills, each one potentially lethal, 14 firearms including 3 assault-style rifles, and $2.3 million in U.S. currency, bundled and ready for transport to Mexico. But it is what agents find in the hidden compartment beneath Vega's bedroom floor that changes everything. 3 encrypted hard drives, a leather-bound ledger with coded entries dating back to 2019, and a sealed manila envelope containing photographs, banking records, and what appears to be a schedule of payments to someone identified only by the initials RD. The fentanyl alone was enough to deliver lethal doses to over 12 million people. That is more than the entire population of Washington state. That is enough poison to kill every man, woman, and child in the Seattle metropolitan area 3 times over. And it was sitting in a suburban neighborhood, waiting to hit the streets, while someone in local government was allegedly looking the other way. The investigation had just begun. 36 hours after the raids, inside a secure FBI cyber forensics facility in Seattle, analysts work around the clock to crack the encryption on Vega's hard drives. The room hums with the quiet intensity of keyboards and cooling fans. Coffee cups pile up. eyes stay fixed on screens. At 2:17 a.m. on January 30th, they break through. What they find is not just a drug operation. It is an architecture of corruption so sophisticated that it takes investigators 3 days just to map the basic structure. The operation had a name. Vega and his associates called it Proyecto Cascada, Project Cascade, and it was designed to do something that federal investigators had never seen at this scale in the Pacific Northwest. It was designed to turn Snohomish County into a permanent cartel logistics hub, a safe zone, a fortress. The network diagram spreads across multiple screens like a malignant web. At the center sits Marco Vega, but the threads extend outward in every direction. Shell companies registered in Delaware and Nevada, a trucking firm that moved legitimate agricultural goods alongside hidden compartments of narcotics, a restaurant chain that laundered money through inflated supply invoices, a charitable foundation that existed on paper to support youth athletics but in reality funneled cartel profits into real estate investments. And then there are the payments. The ledger recovered from Vega's residence contains meticulous records of monthly transfers. The recipients are identified by initials and code names, but the amounts are precise. The dates are consistent, and the pattern is unmistakable. Someone with significant local authority was being paid to ensure that Proyecto Cascada operated without interference. Federal analysts begin cross-referencing the payment dates with public records. They examine council meeting schedules, permit approvals, law enforcement deployment patterns, and zoning decisions. What they find makes their blood run cold. Every single time a payment was logged in the ledger, something favorable happened for cartel operations within the following 2 weeks. A code enforcement complaint against a suspected stash house was dismissed due to procedural errors. A routine patrol schedule was adjusted, creating a gap in coverage on a key transportation route. A permit application for a warehouse later identified as a distribution point was expedited through review. And sitting at the center of many of these decisions, according to the investigators' analysis, was a fictional county official named Richard Davenport, a man who had served in local government for 12 years. A man who had built a reputation as a tough-on-crime moderate. A man who, prosecutors would later allege, had been receiving between $15,000 and $40,000 per month from Sinaloa cartel intermediaries since 2019. This is not corruption. This is command-level collusion. This is a public official allegedly selling out his community to foreign drug traffickers and helping them build a narcotics empire in his own backyard. And the worst part? According to the evidence, he was not alone. The encrypted files contained references to at least 7 other compromised individuals. 3 were identified as local law enforcement officers. 2 appeared to be county employees with access to permitting and inspection records. The remaining 2 were still being investigated, but the digital trail suggested connections to regional transportation authorities. Project Cascade was not just a drug trafficking operation. It was a systematic infiltration, a hostile takeover conducted in slow motion, paid for in monthly installments, and protected by people who had sworn oaths to serve their community. Federal prosecutors began preparing charges. But first, they needed to finish what the January 28th raids had started. The operation was about to expand. February 3rd, 2026, 4 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. A joint command center in a secure federal facility outside Seattle. On the wall, a massive digital display shows a map of Washington state. Red markers pulse across the screen. There are 47 of them. Each one represents a target identified through the analysis of Vega's seized files and the subsequent investigation. They are not all drug houses. Some are businesses. Some are residences of suspected corrupt officials. Some are financial institutions where cartel money allegedly moved through compliant hands. Inside the command center, representatives from the FBI, IC Homeland Security Investigations, the DEA, and Washington State Patrol coordinate the largest multi-agency operation the Pacific Northwest has ever seen. Operation Clean Cascade will deploy over 600 federal agents, 200 state and local officers from jurisdictions not implicated in the corruption probe, 14 SWAT teams, 8 Black Hawk helicopters for aerial support and rapid response, and a dedicated FBI surveillance aircraft providing real-time intelligence. The objective is total network eradication. At 4:47 a.m., exactly 1 week after the initial raids, the operation launches. In Marysville, agents hit 3 additional properties linked to Vega's network. In Everett, they raid the headquarters of the trucking company that served as the cartel's primary logistics arm. In Seattle, FBI teams execute search warrants at 2 financial firms suspected of facilitating money laundering. In Lake Stevens, a suspected drug superlab operating in a converted barn is breached by a combined DEA and SWAT team. What they find inside exceeds even the worst projections. industrial-scale methamphetamine production equipment, precursor chemicals sufficient to manufacture hundreds of pounds of product, and evidence that the operation had been running for at least 3 years without detection. In Arlington, ICE agents raid a house that surveillance had identified as a human trafficking way station. They find 14 individuals, including 6 who are later identified as minors, being held against their will. Some of them had been there for months, waiting to be moved to other locations or put to work in cartel-connected operations. Across Washington state, from Bellingham to Vancouver, from the Cascade foothills to the coastal communities of the Olympic Peninsula, federal agents execute raids, serve warrants, and make arrests. By noon, the preliminary results are in. 112 suspects taken into federal custody, an additional 23 pounds of fentanyl seized, 19 pounds of methamphetamine recovered, 11 pounds of cocaine confiscated, $4.7 million in currency and assets frozen or seized. The 3 suspected drug production facilities shut down, 2 human trafficking operations dismantled, and 1 fictional county official, Richard Davenport, taken into custody at his home in Snohomish County at 6:23 a.m., charged with racketeering conspiracy, money laundering, and public corruption in connection with narcotics trafficking. The cartel network that had spent years building its presence in Washington state had taken more damage in 6 hours than it had suffered in the previous 6 years combined. But the revelations were far from over. As agents began processing the evidence seized during Operation Clean Cascade, the scope of the corruption became devastatingly clear. The analysis of server data recovered from a property linked to the cartel's financial operations revealed a detailed accounting of payments to compromised individuals. Over 7 years, the network had allegedly paid out more than $3.2 million in bribes to local officials, law enforcement officers, and private citizens who provided essential services to the trafficking operation. 3 Snohomish County Sheriff's deputies were identified as having received regular payments in exchange for providing advance warning of patrol schedules and planned enforcement actions. Federal agents arrested all 3 within 48 hours of the Operation Clean Cascade raids. A fictional building inspector named Gerald Morrison was charged with accepting bribes to approve permits and overlook code violations at cartel-linked properties. According to prosecutors, Morrison had enabled the establishment of at least 4 stash houses and 1 production facility by certifying that the properties met all relevant standards when they clearly did not. A former court clerk was indicted for allegedly providing the cartel network with information about pending warrants and judicial proceedings, allowing suspects to evade arrest and witnesses to be intimidated before they could testify. And most disturbingly, evidence suggested that at least 2 members of a regional drug task force had been compromised. These were officers specifically assigned to combat narcotics trafficking who, according to prosecutors, had been feeding information to the very networks they were supposed to be dismantling. The betrayal cut deep into the heart of law enforcement. Officers who had served alongside the compromised individuals spoke of feeling sick, violated, furious. One veteran detective, speaking on condition of anonymity, described it as discovering that your own family had been selling you out for years. The corruption investigation expanded rapidly. By mid-February, federal prosecutors had filed charges against 17 individuals connected to the protection network. The cases would take months, possibly years, to work through the court system. But the immediate impact was undeniable. The cartel's safe zone had been shattered. The protection network that had allowed Proyecto Cascada to operate with near impunity had been exposed and dismantled. And a message had been sent to any other compromised officials who might be watching. There is nowhere to hide. But the investigation revealed something even more alarming than the local corruption. The analysis of Vega's seized files and the subsequent forensic examination of cartel communications showed that Proyecto Cascada was not an isolated operation. It was a template. The Sinaloa cartel had been using the Pacific Northwest network as a test case for a broader strategy. If they could successfully establish a protected logistics hub in Washington state, they planned to replicate the model in other regions across the country. The encrypted files contained preliminary assessments of potential expansion targets: Oregon, Northern California, Colorado. The cartel was actively scouting for corruptible officials, identifying law enforcement vulnerabilities, and mapping transportation routes for future operations. The Washington network was designed to be the first node in a nationwide infrastructure, a permanent, protected corridor for moving narcotics from the Mexican border to markets across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. The scope was staggering. According to the seized planning documents, the cartel believed that with sufficient political protection, they could move up to 500 pounds of fentanyl per month through the Washington corridor alone. At street-level distribution, that quantity represented billions of dollars in potential revenue and millions of potentially lethal doses flooding American communities. And they were confident they could do it, because they had spent years proving that American officials could be bought, that American systems could be corrupted, that American communities could be exploited. They had built their operation on a foundation of cynicism about American institutions. And for a while, that cynicism had been justified. But not anymore. The human cost of what Proyecto Cascada represented cannot be measured in pounds of narcotics or dollars of seized currency. In 2024 alone, over 107,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. Fentanyl was involved in approximately 70% of those deaths. In Washington state, overdose fatalities increased by 23% compared to the previous year. In Snohomish County, where the cartel had established its protected hub, the rate was even higher. These are not just statistics. They are mothers who never came home. They are fathers who fell asleep and never woke up. They are sons and daughters whose lives ended before they really began, their potential erased by a synthetic poison manufactured in clandestine labs and smuggled across borders by organizations that view human beings as nothing more than revenue sources. Every pound of fentanyl that moved through Marco Vega's network represented thousands of potential deaths. Every month that Richard Davenport allegedly accepted cartel payments, more poison flowed into his own community. Every time a compromised deputy looked the other way, more families were destroyed. The cost is incalculable, and the responsibility extends far beyond the traffickers themselves. Because corruption is not a victimless crime. When a public official takes money to protect a drug network, they become complicit in every overdose that results. When a law enforcement officer sells out their badge, they share responsibility for every death that could have been prevented. That is the reality that the defendants in this case will have to face. That is the weight they will carry, regardless of whatever sentences they ultimately receive. In the weeks following Operation Clean Cascade, federal authorities announced additional actions targeting cartel infrastructure across the western United States. The Department of Homeland Security designated the Sinaloa Cartel as a priority transnational criminal organization, authorizing expanded use of intelligence resources and cross-border cooperation with Mexican authorities. The FBI established a dedicated task force focused on public corruption cases linked to drug trafficking, with a specific mandate to identify and prosecute compromised officials at all levels of government. ICE Homeland Security Investigations expanded its presence in the Pacific Northwest, deploying additional agents and resources to prevent the cartel from re-establishing its networks. And in Washington state, the governor announced a comprehensive review of all local law enforcement agencies implicated in the corruption probe, with a stated goal of rebuilding public trust through transparency and accountability. The message was clear. The days of cartel-protected safe zones on American soil were over, but the work is far from finished. For every network that gets dismantled, another is being built. For every corrupt official who gets arrested, others remain hidden. For every pound of fentanyl that gets seized, more is crossing the border. This is not a fight that ends with a single operation or a single prosecution. This is a generational struggle against organizations that have resources measured in billions of dollars and patience measured in decades. The cartels are not going away, but neither are the agents, investigators, prosecutors, and communities who are determined to stop them. If you are still watching this, you understand something that too many people refuse to accept. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it moves quietly. Sometimes it wears a suit and sits in a government office. Sometimes it hides behind a badge or a business license or a charitable foundation. The most dangerous corruption is the kind you cannot see, the kind that operates in plain sight, protected by the very institutions that are supposed to prevent it, the kind that poisons communities while pretending to serve them. That is what Proyecto Cascada represented. That is what federal agents destroyed when they kicked in those doors on January 28th. And that is what we must remain vigilant against every single day. Because the cartels are watching, they are learning, they are adapting, and they are always looking for the next official who can be bought, the next system that can be corrupted, the next community that can be exploited. The only thing standing between them and their goals is the willingness of Americans to demand accountability, to refuse to look the other way, to insist that the people who hold positions of public trust actually deserve that trust. This story is a warning, not just about the cartels, but about the vulnerability of our own institutions, about the price of complacency, about what happens when we assume that someone else is taking care of the problem. Marco Alejandro Vega is currently awaiting trial on federal charges including conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, racketeering, and money laundering. If convicted on all counts, he faces a mandatory minimum of 20 years in federal prison and a potential life sentence. Richard Davenport, the fictional county official, has pleaded not guilty to all charges. His attorneys have characterized the prosecution as politically motivated and have demanded the release of all evidence in the government's possession. His trial is expected to begin later this year. The 17 other individuals charged in connection with the corruption investigation are at various stages of the legal process. Several have already entered guilty pleas in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations. The investigation continues. Federal prosecutors have indicated that additional charges are possible as the analysis of seized evidence proceeds. And somewhere in Mexico, cartel leadership is assessing the damage, calculating the losses, and planning their next move. This fight is not over. It has barely begun. If this story resonated with you, share it. If you believe that corruption needs to be dragged into the light, make your voice heard. If you want to see more coverage of federal operations targeting cartel networks and the officials who protect them, subscribe and stay informed. Because the only way these stories get told is if people care enough to listen, and if people care enough to demand the truth. This was a fictional dramatization inspired by real events and real issues facing American communities. The names of public officials in this story were invented for dramatic purposes. But the threat is real, the corruption is real, and the consequences are being felt by real families in real neighborhoods across this country. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and never stop demanding accountability from the people who are supposed to serve you.